Welcome. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to join me for a little bit of a conversation about pillars to success, in particular, focusing in on leadership and negotiation and the strategy, knowledge, and skills associated with these two interconnected realms. Um, so, what I'd like to do is kind of talk through some different things. We may or may not. It looks like there's about 8 or 10 people on the call. So instead of, I had at one point was thinking about doing a breakout, maybe we still can. Sam, is that okay to do? We can put people in rooms for a couple minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It can be random. It doesn't have to be anything, you know, uh, set up beforehand. So, okay, good. So, folks, I'm gonna go ahead and sort of dive in here, and in many ways, what I'd like to do is start with a bit of a story about what I see as successful leadership. So, the story is this. There once was a rider on horseback who came across a squad of soldiers trying to move a heavy piece of timber. A corporal stood by giving lordly orders to heave, but the piece of timber was simply too heavy. Um, "Why don't you help them?" the rider quietly and respectfully asked. "Me? I'm a corporal, sir." Dismounting, the rider carefully took his place with the soldiers. "Now all together, boys, heave," he said, and the big piece of timber slid into place. The rider mounted his horse and turned to the corporal. "The next time you have a piece of timber for your men to handle, corporal, send for your commander in chief." The horseman was George Washington. So, what I love about this particular story is that I think this is what effective leadership really looks like. You see a corporal who is standing and giving orders and not helping his men. Clearly, they're struggling. And along comes the commander in chief of the army, in President George Washington. And he doesn't hesitate to get off his horse and roll up his sleeves, if you will, and help uh, everybody to slide the piece of timber and to accomplish the goal. And I think for leaders, the best leaders that I've worked with that I know have a humility to them, and they see themselves as part of a team. They don't see themselves as aloof or separate from um, the rest of the group. And in particular, they understand how important the connection is between leaders and followers. And they nurture that connection. They don't take advantage of it, but they grow it and they help those followers to become the best leaders they can be. So I'll say more about that in a little bit. And my goal here is also to help you to understand and intertwine the relationship between leadership and negotiation, because I think a lot of people, when they think about negotiation, they typically don't think that they negotiate a lot as part of their job and part of their work. And in fact, the reality is actually that they do negotiate every day, all the time. And I'll make that case and tell you more about the crossover between leadership and negotiation because it's really important. And in essence, what all of this really means is it's kind of a deep dive in how do you deal with people effectively, which is really what leaders and negotiators do. Okay. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that I see leaders and negotiators make is this. So H.L. Mencken was a theorist, etc., and he said for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And I really love this quote because I find that too often leaders and negotiators look for the quick solution. They look to do something instead of to do the best thing possible. And so, as a leader and a negotiator, what I would say to you is make sure that you're always keeping in your mind that if I'm dealing with a very complicated problem, it's very likely that there's going to be a complicated solution. And I need that in order to match what I'm doing, right? So resist just coming up with something simple, something easy. And a lot of times your followers are going to want that. They're going to want you to say, just tell us what to do. Give us a solution. And too often, those solutions end up being ineffective. So I would encourage you to slow down and to make good decisions, not just the easy ones. And I'll talk more about that as we go. And I think you'll see that the kinds of things that we do talk about um, require that you're really thinking deeply. And it's really important for you to understand what is the problem that we're really dealing with and what are all the different ways that we can manage. Okay, so with that in mind, let's sort of dive in here. Now, the good news is that you're all leaders and negotiators. The question is, how do you do this effectively, right? You might say, okay, I could see that perhaps I'm a leader. Maybe I'm not a formal leader, but I definitely lead informally, which is what many of us do. And as I mentioned before, we negotiate every day. Where anytime we're disagreeing or we're having to work on a project or a problem or a challenge comes up, in my mind, that's when you start negotiating. And so you do this internally with your colleagues, with your bosses, with those people you oversee, and of course, externally with clients and companies and contractors and you name it. So we do this all day, every day. And it's really important to see yourself as both a leader and negotiator in your life because these are the kind of skills that are going to help you to excel. Okay. So here's what I'd like you to do, and I'm going to ask Sam to just pop you into small groups here, maybe 4 or 5 people per group. I want you to just take a total of 5 minutes, maybe 4 minutes, because we got started a little bit late. And I want you to just talk about who's the best leader that you've ever had and why? What is it that they did so well? And how were they different than other leaders that you've had? Okay. So Sam, if you could go ahead and just divide the group into um, a couple different ones of 4 or 5 people and just dive in. And like I said, we'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes to do this. I have 12 at the moment.
Perfect. Just getting that set up now.
Sure.
All right. I think everybody should have gotten an invite to a room.
Let's see if looks like Melissa and there we go. So Sam, we had a lot more people registered, huh?
Yeah, we had like it's probably closer to 75 now. I've been getting registrations even as recent as like this morning,
So are
even a
people
few
having
minutes before.
are
So I'm
people
wondering if
having
Cambridge is like if Puerto Rico's having a hard time getting in.
hmm. How many people are on now? Like 8 or 9?
Yeah.
Huh,
Let's see. One,
that's
two,
weird.
three. Yeah, there's only like six of them.
Huh, weird. Okay, well, ultimately, I guess, they can at least view the recording, right?
Yeah. So I've been saving, since we
And
did it through Zoom, it's a little bit different. We were able to do like the registration. So I have everybody's information. I believe I was able to get, yes, all of their, email addresses. So I'll make sure that once I get the recording like finished up, Jen usually kind of, um, oh, let
yeah.
me.
Did you get anything that's saying um that people were having a hard time coming in?
No,
Or
I haven't. I've been checking my emails and like my chat and seeing if I've gotten anything. But I have noticed like even Santiago
yeah.
Mendez, he has registered like three different times as of within the past 25 minutes, 15 minutes, 14 minutes, 13 minutes ago. So I'm thinking that they're having a hard time getting in.
Yeah, do you have his email address or
I
no?
do right
Maybe you
here.
could reach out to him and just sort of say, "Hey, are you guys, is there something going on? Because there's like 75 people registered and they're, you know,
Yeah, absolutely. I'll reach out to him right now.
okay." And then if you can go ahead and like, it's 12:15, so let's bring people back at like 12:17.
Sure.
So if you just give me a quick heads up, like maybe shoot him a quick email and then we can bring people back.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thanks.
Let's see. I just sent that. We'll give them a couple more, another minute
Okay.
or
Yeah, one more minute would be
sure.
great. Hey Sam, whatever happened to that guy Brandon?
I have not heard back from him. I tried to reach out to him again this week. I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
it's weird. And that other guy that you said applied and then sort of, who knows?
Yeah, he provided an invalid number. So I reached out to him via email and I wasn't able to hear back. But I did just get an appointment request for an applicant. I believe he's for the fall, but maybe I can try to um, encourage him to do the spring instead. I have a meeting with him next week. So I'll let you know how that goes as well. But he's Christopher Martin. I believe he's an applicant for fall.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, let's go ahead and bring folks back and
All right.
then maybe are they on, I guess I can have them just raise their hands and kind of give us a idea. So okay. Let me know. I guess I'll be able to see when they come back.
All right. Perfect. I'll close all rooms now. Okay. They're given 60 seconds.
Yep. All right, is everybody back? Not quite.
Think there's a few more we're waiting for.
Okay. All right, I think everyone's back. Looks like it. So I'm curious, if folks could maybe just raise their hand and give me a quick sense of what would the answer, what did you all discuss and what were the answers to sort of the idea of, the best leaders, what did they do, and how are they different? So Michelle, please, how are you?
Hi. So I had Dario and Ruth in our group, and we talked about from a good leader perspective, someone who listened, someone who helped us to achieve our goals, someone who empowered us as employees and trusted us, and then certainly let us make our own mistakes. And versus giving, Dario gave the example of not a leader who gives the answer, but lets you try it out first on your own
Hmm,
and then gives guidance. So really, overall, I feel like it was a provided that guidance, but empowered us to be able to learn and grow underneath them.
got it. Great. Okay. Anybody else want to comment or share anything perhaps a little bit different than what Michelle brought up in terms of what people did really well, or on the flip side, what are some things that leaders did um, that you had that were not effective and that really kind of uh, made your life miserable? Because we've all had those leaders, unfortunately. Anybody have that kind of experience? Let's give it a
I can
minute.
sh- I
Yeah,
can
go ahead,
share what
Michelle.
we had. Yeah, I'm happy
Sure.
to share what we had to kick it off. So we had didn't give any authority, didn't empower us, didn't provide any direction, kind of left us flailing on our own, and
Yeah,
certainly leaders who were not kind.
perfect. Yeah. Like I said, I think we've all had those folks, and it's interesting. As you all know, I direct or I think you know that I direct the Masters in Organizational Leadership and Negotiation. And I would say over the course of the past 11 years, I've had about 9 or 10 people who have actually quit their jobs once they've learned what an effective leader looks like. And they look around and say, I don't see anybody like that here, so why would I stay? So I think it becomes quite clear when you have a good leader and what they do and how you feel, and then when you don't, what the opposite is. So great, thank you, I appreciate it. Okay, So let me just kind of talk a little bit about in terms of some things that might surprise you. Um, so again, I am a big fan of the notion that leadership is actually much more about actions. It's much less about a role. I mean, I think you can all think of people, perhaps, who you've worked with in the past who, they didn't necessarily have the title of CEO or COO or something like that. They weren't part of the leadership team, but they absolutely were leaders, and they were the kind of people that you sought out for help, for assistance, to work on things, to talk things through, etc. So if you think about leadership in that way, you know, anybody can be a leader. And I really genuinely believe that. And some of the best leaders that I've ever met are folks who are informal in that capacity, right? And so I'm curious if you could just put in the chat box for 1 second, what makes an informal leader so effective? If you've encountered these folks, like what do they do that is so um, persuasive and engaging and things like that. Anybody have a thought there? Like I said, I think most of us have had the experience um, of having engaged with these folks. Right? They communicate well, right? That's for sure. Um, and they carried others along. Interesting to you. Um, and I think that's one interesting part about leadership is that leaders, I always think about leadership as kind of a team sport, if I can put it that way. In other words, leaders recognize that they cannot do their work by themselves and that they're only as good as the people around them. And optimistic, I would say, is definitely something. And yeah, Lillian, the servant leadership approach where you are clear in your mind that the reason that you're doing this is to serve others. It's not about you. It's about serving other people and making their lives and their jobs and things like that better. Good, great, thank you. So a lot of people know more about leadership, but they don't know that much about negotiation. And, I've been working in the world of negotiation for 30 years. And, if you don't think that you negotiate, I hate to tell you this, but you're kind of missing the boat, as I would put it, because we all do this every day, even with our spouses and partners and children and parents, all of that stuff, we negotiate. And when you learn the knowledge and skills associated with negotiation, um, ultimately what you find is, and what you realize is actually you do this all the time. So just to give you a general definition, when two or more parties need to reach a joint decision, you're negotiating. But often what happens is that they have different preferences, and what they do is they engage in a discussion to see if they can meet their respective objectives. So what does that mean, really? It means that anytime we've got a issue, a problem, a challenge, we want to create a deal with somebody, and maybe we have these slightly different preferences, we engage with somebody to see if we can meet those needs, right? And it's not negotiation, the goal of negotiation is not necessarily to reach agreement. And that surprises a lot of people when I say it. The goal of negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible. And so I want you to keep that in mind. And for me, negotiation is one tool that we have to use to either create a deal, build a relationship, or resolve conflict, right? And those are three really important things that we do in the workplace. And then in terms of our own careers, it's essential that we know how to do those things. And that's where negotiation plays a role. So, in some ways, the way that I like to describe it is negotiation is the how-to of leadership. Um, so, let me just ask this, and you can put it into the chat box. So, who do you think, now that I've described negotiation in that way, who do you think you negotiate with on a regular basis? So, go ahead and put that in the chat. Let me know who is it that you, when you think about it now. Um, so, absolutely, employees, great. That's going to be a very big part of your job. And a lot of times, people will say, well, when it comes to negotiation, it's not about coercion, it's about persuasion, right? So, with your employees, you're going to get a lot further over the long term if you are persuading them, working with them, bringing them into the process as opposed to just telling them what to do. Yes, Michelle, for sure, your teenagers. Those are some of the most interesting challenges that we face in our personal lives is when our kids get into those periods in their life where things are a little bit difficult for them in school and around them and things along those lines. So absolutely. Um, and as Tinu says, almost everyone, managers as well. You got it. So I think you can all see how we do this all the time, every day, right? And so really important to keep that in mind. So what's the connection here? So for me, leadership in its truest form is about creating a vision, right? So when we're a leader and we want to take people somewhere, right? We want to have a goal. Part of what we do is we create a vision. We have to help them to see where it is that we're going, right? Engaging and respecting the relationship between the leader and followers. I mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again because you can't lead if you don't have people who will genuinely follow you and support you. That's one of the critical elements to all of this. And I think a lot of leaders tend to sort of fail to understand that, or ineffective leaders fail to understand that aspect of leadership. As I mentioned, the best leaders are persuading those around you to come along as opposed to just telling you what to do. Of course, a leader can tell you what to do, but it's hard to buy in when that's the case, right? Much more persuasive if I'm engaging you, getting your input, getting your thoughts on our vision and plan, and then bringing you into the process. And also, I think, lastly, leadership in its truest form is about adapting to new challenges as they arise. In the world of leadership, we often talk about adaptive leadership. And adaptive leadership is when we don't really understand a problem yet. Like we something comes up, for example, and perhaps one of the best examples in recent memory is COVID, right? When COVID arose, um, most leaders around the world didn't really know what to do with it. We didn't even know what it was. And so we had to take time to figure out what is this thing and how do we respond? And the nature of many leadership challenges is that we have to adapt and adjust as we get new information, right? So we started to deal with COVID by distancing ourselves and things like, and quarantining ourselves and things like that. Then, when we learned more, we could wear masks and we knew more about how the virus worked. We could then adapt and create policies and things along those lines. That is how a lot of leadership problems work. And if you remember the H.L. Mencken quote, right, um, it's particularly important to have this orientation when we have these kinds of problems that we don't really know. And sometimes leaders are uh, labeled as flip-floppers or people who change too much when they start down the road of a problem. But the reality is that that's actually how we have to deal with most problems because what happens is information reveals itself over time. Right? When we start down the road of dealing with something, we learn how to manage and how to deal with different problems as they arise. And so we necessarily have to adapt to that new information and maybe change course a little bit or add to it or things like that. So as a leader, I would expect to have to adapt and to change and to modify my approach as I deal with most of the kind of challenges that I have to confront. Again, that's a lot of times people sort of have a reaction to that and think that you're not being consistent if you don't stay with an original policy or an original approach. And I would say it's actually not the way that leaders really work effectively. So there's a great book by a guy named Jess Salacuse, a colleague of mine who unfortunately passed away last year. And the book is called Real Leaders Negotiate. And I would encourage you, if you haven't read it or heard of it, to take a look because it really does connect these two things. And so there are in the book and from a leadership and negotiation point of view, these are the places where these two worlds come together and sort of intersect. Okay. And so with leaders, the first is that they provide direction. Okay, so they negotiate to establish goals of the organization, and then they negotiate internally to achieve them. Excuse me for one second. Let me just shut this door here. Sorry about that little uh, co- uh, traffic around these parts. Anyway, so again, when we set a
Hi,
direct,
Dr. Weiss. I wanted just to say hi that I am here.
okay,
Dr. Santiago Mendez, the campus dean of Puerto Rico. I also want to welcome uh, you, Lilian Centeno, Ruth Rocco, Michelle Brescia, Dario Ocadeo, Atitino Melissa, Arelis, and Arelis is no taker, and thanks Samantha and Carlos Costa. We have some issues trying to access the link, but probably you will see that there are not enough people going into, but keep on doing it. Okay, I will be here just in case somebody needs to speak Spanish. I will be trying to help you with the translation. Okay, estoy aquí disponible. Mi nombre es el doctor Santiago Méndez Hernández. Soy el decano del campus de Puerto Rico los fines de semana. Cualquier pregunta que tengan que hacer al doctor Weiss en español, con gusto le puedo ayudar. Keep
okay.
on.
Thank you, Santiago. Thank you for joining. And I'm sorry you all had trouble getting on, but thankfully it's recorded, so you'll be able to people can listen later as well. So, as I mentioned, the first thing is that idea of setting a direction or a vision, right? And then you have to negotiate to establish those goals and internally to achieve them. The second idea and a task of a leader is integration. So we often have to bring diverse groups together who have different interests and needs within our organization to negotiate common goals, right? If you're in sales and there's a marketing department and a research and development department and a series of project managers, often we have to bring everybody together and sometimes those goals are different for the different groups, and so we have to figure out, can we negotiate some kind of a common goal as part of all of this? Okay. The third is conflict management, so helping members of the organization to effectively resolve difficult conflicts. As a leader, sometimes you're tasked with that, and it's critical that you step in and do that. Um, and as a negotiator, you might be handling these things, but you might also be helping to teach people how to handle these difficult conflicts. The fourth way to do it is the fourth task is education. So we want to educate and set others up for success since followers are the key. I think we heard from the breakouts that this is what effective leaders do, right? They educate and they include people in the process as part of all this. The next task is this idea of motivation. So leaders have to motivate others, and that often requires negotiation to understand their underlying interests. When we say interests here, we mean goals, right? We mean the things that are most important to them as part of the process. The sixth task is representation. So leaders often have to represent their organizations and negotiate on their behalf. And then finally, trust creation. So negotiation is a key to building and preserving trust, not only between negotiators, but between leaders and led and things along those lines. So there's a lot of places where there's this kind of intersection and interaction between leadership and negotiation, and they go hand in hand. And as I mentioned, to me, when people talk about how to be an effective leader, what they're really relying on are good negotiation skills. And that might be persuasion, it might be empathy, it might be assertiveness, things like that. So, as I said, what are some of these skills that you need as both a leader and a negotiator? So, one of the most important is persuasion, right? So, um, we can at times coerce people to do things, but my experience, and I'm guessing it's probably your experience as well, is that coercion usually pushes people away. It doesn't engage them and it doesn't get the best out of them. So the opposite of that is really to persuade them, is to um, try to create this vision and then use skills to help them to understand why what you're saying makes the most sense. And there's a great quote by an Italian diplomat, a guy named Daniel Valer, who said, diplomacy or negotiation is the art of letting the other person have your way. I hope that translates, Santiago, or maybe you can put the translation into the chat. But the idea is that the best uh, persuaders effectively are those that are able to present an idea in such a way that people not only see it as in part as their own, but want to be part of the implementation and the thinking through, etc. And so that's a real skill that people have. Also, problem solving. So to me, leadership and negotiation really is much more about problem solving than anything else. As leaders and negotiators, we're confronted with all kinds of problems and challenges. And so the best leaders that I know apply creativity and problem solving to the challenges that come up. And there's ways of doing that. Too often people confuse problem solving with compromise. And compromise, for me, is not the greatest way to do things because often people leave the table or leave a situation feeling not so great about the solution because people had to give things up. And sometimes maybe they do have to give things up. But what I've found over the course of my career is actually that when you problem solve, you can often find solutions that don't require that. And really important that you learn the skill of problem solving and apply it more so than anything else. Um, then there's communication. Of course, if we can't communicate effectively, um, we're going to struggle. And the reality is, when we communicate, we have to do it, um, especially when we run into problems. One of the problems is that people stop communicating when things get difficult. And actually, that's the time when we need to be communicating more and talking more and understanding more about what's going on. Empathy is the next skill, which is really understanding. One of the biggest mistakes I see people making in negotiation in particular is that when they're preparing to negotiate, they go in and they think about what they need, which is perfectly reasonable and makes sense. But if you're trying to influence the person that you're negotiating with, you also have to spend some time thinking, what do they need? What are their goals here? And are those um, compatible or are they different than my own needs? And what I've found is the more you can empathize with the other side, the more disarming it is. If someone comes in and they're upset or frustrated or angry about a situation, if you can say to them, for example, I thought a little bit about what you might need to get out of this negotiation, um, there's an amazing way in which that disarms the other side because you've demonstrated that you actually care about what they need just as much as what you do, right? And most negotiations, by the way, I split negotiations into two groups. One group is um, where it's a one-off kind of situation. So you're going to negotiate once and then you'll never see that person again. But most of our negotiations are with the same people and the same companies and organizations over and over again. And so the more you negotiate, you want your approach to be better and you want to reach the best deal possible, not just any deal, right? And that's what happens when you empathize with the other side. Empathy means non-judgmentally entering another person's world, which is very hard to do, but also incredibly valuable if you can do it. Then there's assertiveness. Assertiveness is um, being able to ask for what it is that you really need. So you can't succeed as a leader or a negotiator if you don't ask. And too often people confuse assertiveness with aggressiveness. And there's a big difference. So there's a way of describing that I've always liked. One of my colleagues likes to say this. Assertiveness is standing on your own 2 feet. Assertiveness is standing on your own 2 feet. Aggressiveness is standing on somebody else's toes. Santiago, I don't know if you want to translate that in the chat for folks, but again, assertiveness is standing on your own 2 feet, right? You have to be able to express and share what you need. And then aggressiveness is standing on somebody else's toes. In other words, you're sort of stepping on somebody else in order to get where you want to go. Okay. Um, the next skill that is really essential, and again, remember that in any leadership and negotiation challenge that we are always working with incomplete information, right? If I were to negotiate with Santiago, there would be things that I would know when I started the negotiation, and things that Santiago would know. And part of what happens over the course of a negotiation is that we share some information and we learn more and more about what each other needs. Okay. And what's really important here is that because of that, we are all, Santiago is going to say something that I didn't really know was part of the negotiation. And I'm going to have to take that information in and deal with it. And that's where adaptability and flexibility becomes so important. If I can't do that, then I'm going to get nervous, right? If Santiago brings up something I hadn't thought about and I had a plan when I went in, well, now I'm nervous and now I don't know what to do. But if I go in with a flexible mindset and I say, I know that the other person is going to probably bring up something that I had not anticipated, I have to be flexible and I have to deal with it um, in the moment, or I have to step away and deal with it. But that mindset is essential. Okay. So what I want to do is just kind of share with you a couple of key skills. We've got about 15, 20 minutes left, so I'll go through these, but I thought this would be most helpful for you because these are things that you can take and use tomorrow in your negotiation or your leadership endeavors. All right. So as leaders and negotiators, we need to focus on what we would call underlying interests. Okay. So underlying interests are really, really important in negotiation. And let me begin with a story. So there's a very famous negotiation book called Getting to Yes. It was written by some of my colleagues that I've worked with at Harvard University for a number of years. And they begin the book by talking about this approach to negotiation with a story. And the story goes that there are two sisters who are arguing over an orange, as you see on your screen. Okay. And they go back and forth and they're arguing back and forth about different things and who should get it and why. And finally, they say, well, we should just split it. We'll each take half of the orange. Okay. And when they do that, so one of the sisters cuts the orange in half. And when they do that, the sister on the left-hand side goes over to the garbage, peels the orange, and throws away the peel and keeps the fruit to make her juice. Okay. And similarly, after she's done making her juice, the other sister goes over to the garbage and peels the orange and throws away the fruit and keeps the peel because she wanted to make a cake, as you can see, using the peel. Now, if the two sisters had explained why they needed the orange, that one of them wanted the fruit to make juice and the other wanted the peel to make a cake, each would have gotten twice as much, right? But because they didn't do that, because they just compromised, they ended up getting less. And the key to negotiation from where I sit and how I approach negotiation is this idea of trying to understand why, what is the underlying interest of the people involved in the negotiation. Okay. And this is different than positions. All right. So positions are kind of what people say they want, and interests are why they want them. So think about an iceberg. Okay. Not a lot of icebergs in your part of the world, Santiago, but the idea is, and the analogy is important. Okay. So in negotiation generally, and in our leadership challenges, positions are the tip of the iceberg, right? Um, this is what people will share when they sit down to negotiate. But there are lots of other things under the surface that don't get shared, but are actually really motivating the people involved, right? And our goal here is to get at why people want those things. Just like the girls here in the story, why they wanted those oranges was really important. And if they had talked about why, they would have come up with a better deal, right? And so in our negotiations and frankly in our leadership challenges, we run up against this problem a lot where people don't share those underlying things, those things that are under the surface. So our job in negotiation is to figure out how to get to those things. Okay. And as you can see on your screen as well, there are what are called tangible and intangible interests. Tangible just means to touch. Okay. So anything that can be touched as a tangible interest, like money, budgets, land, those are tangible interests. Those are things that, again, are important to people. Then there are intangible interests. Intangible are things that we can't touch, like our identity, our respect as human beings, right? If somebody mistreats you, then um, that might be an underlying interest is that you want to be treated better, right? You want to be respected. You want to be known for something along those lines. And to solve important leadership and negotiation problems, we need to get under the surface. And that's the hard part because what we need is people to ultimately share information, right? That's what's ultimately going on here, right? If I negotiate with Santiago, I have to say, Santiago, if you can tell me what it is that you are really needing as part of this negotiation process, then I have a much better chance of meeting that interest. But there are often in negotiation a lot of things that people don't share that they should that is driving them. And they're often the reasons and the things that get in the way of any kind of agreement. Okay. So let me give you an example of what I mean. All right. So here's a project management example, and it's a pretty simple one. Can you hang on one quick second? Guys, can you put it down? Sorry about that. So in, here's the example that I want to share with you. So we have a project manager who's negotiating with their boss, okay? And the project manager's position is that I want a 1 month extension to finish the project, okay? The boss's position, remember, this is the tip of the iceberg. This is what they're sharing with each other when they start the negotiation or this challenge. The boss's position is that the original deadline stands and you cannot have a 1 month extension, okay? So I need a 1 month extension. You can't have one. All right. Now, let's get into the why, right? And the why is the underlying interests involved in this kind of thing. So, the project manager's underlying interest is this. For her, before facing unforeseen obstacles in completing the project on time, she approved the lead programmer's vacation and wants to demonstrate to her team that she fights for their needs and keeps her word. Right? So if you remember, we talked about tangible and intangible interests. So these are intangible interests, meaning she the most important thing for her and the reason she's asking for the extension is to demonstrate to her team that she fights for their needs, she takes care of them, and that she keeps her word. She made a promise to the programmer that they could take a vacation, right? Okay. For the boss, their underlying interest is to get the project done on time. Okay. So for them, what's most important here, and maybe they shared it, maybe they didn't, is that they need to get the project done on time. Okay. So if that's the case, if we understand these two interests, is there a solution that we can come up with? And in fact, there is. Okay. And here's a couple of ways to address the problem and ultimately what the project manager and the boss did. So the boss says to the project manager, you have discretion, mean it's up to you to change team members assigned to projects and to extend the deadline on another project so that that team member can be brought over during the lead programmer's absence. Okay, so the lead programmer can still go on vacation, but the project manager is given the ability to bring somebody in to complete the job so it still gets done on time. The boss also can approve a budget for overtime compensation or additional support because they have the money. That's not a problem in this case. So what's the result here? The result is the project's done on time without an extension, and the project manager keeps her word to her team on approved vacations. Right? So you see what happens when you get down to this idea of underlying interests. It helps us to get away from trying to come up with a compromise. A compromise solution to this would be, well, you can have a 2 week extension, right? That doesn't really help the project manager and it doesn't help the boss, right? And that's the difference between problem solving and getting to these underlying interests and compromise. Okay. So when you're trying to understand your own interests, one of the key things to do is ask yourself why. Why is something so important? And one of the problems that I see from a leadership and negotiation perspective is that a lot of times people don't actually know or haven't really thought through very clearly what their most important interests are. Um, and so if you don't know that, then you can't be clear in your negotiations or your leadership challenges. And you can't, I think it's really important that you're able to share with the other side. This is what I really need to achieve. And I don't, I'm not going to compromise on those things, but I can be creative in terms of how we get there. Right. So you start with yourself and you keep asking yourself, why do I need that? Why is that so critically important to me as part of this process? Right. And then you kind of flip, and this is where that idea of empathy comes in that we talked about before, right? Part of your job is to put yourself in their shoes, right? If you want to say, what do I know about them? What do I think they need here? And then how do I ask questions to try to get at that information, right? If we go back to the boss, as the project manager, I could be saying, what constraints do you have, right? Given what I've told you that I've promised this to the lead programmer, um, is that a problem for you? Or how can we think creatively so that I can still um, stay true to my word, but get the job done in the way that you've talked about? And the boss says, well, we have extra money. You could bring somebody else in, etc. So when you're thinking about this, what you want to be doing is asking open-ended questions. Okay, so tell me more about what you're really trying to achieve here. Why is this so important to you, etc. And you're gathering information. Remember that I told you in most leadership and negotiation challenges, our goal is to gather information. It's to get as much information as we can about what's going on so that we can make the best decision possible. All right. So again, here's just some really simple questions that you can ask, a negotiation counterpart, or if, you're dealing with a leadership challenge or endeavor. So tell me about why something is so important to you. Or is there an underlying concern that you have that I don't understand or that I'm not aware of? Now, again, these kinds of questions um, require a little bit of a relationship, right? People aren't always going to offer these up um, initially, but the more you share, the more you can share with the other side and say, look, here's what's kind of motivating us here, especially when the relationship matters. Then, the other side is going to be likely to do that as well. But you have to create this reciprocal arrangement of sharing information, right? And sometimes it means that you go first. Like one of the things that I often will say in my negotiations is, look, I'm going to tell you something that's really important to me. And my hope is we can think about how to satisfy that need and that you'll also share with me what's important to you. Okay. And that's how the best negotiations work with people who we've got to negotiate with time and again. All right. So that's the first idea. The second idea, and again, I know um, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but the second idea is this notion of, I'm going to skip that, is the idea of creativity. And I talked about solving, and one of the best ways to problem solve is is to brainstorm. So again, if you think back to the project manager and the boss, right? Once they understood what their interests were, they could think creatively like this. So one of the things that I do when if I'm presenting a way forward as a leader or if I'm negotiating is to say, okay, now that we understand those interests that we just talked about, right? Let's get out a whiteboard or a computer screen or something, and let's start to think together about what are the best solutions possible, right? And so that's a partnership sort of approach. And there's a process piece to this, right? If Santiago and I are negotiating over something and we start to engage in brainstorming, right? We each have a hand in the solution. And often when we do that, it means that people are much more likely to actually go along with the solution, right? If you and I come up with something together, as opposed to you telling me what the solution is going to be, it's much more likely that I'm going to go along with it. And so, like I said, I think most of you probably know a bit about brainstorming. Brainstorming, it's interesting. A lot of people say, well, brainstorming's been around a long time and maybe there are better, different approaches that we could use. I will tell you that for me, this is the kind of thing that I do, whether I call it brainstorming or not. I try to get people to sort of say, okay, so here's our problem. We understand what the underlying interests are, what's most important to us. Now, what do we do with it? What are the possibilities in front of us? And I really like doing it that way because when we first start to negotiate or we have a leadership challenge, people will have ideas about how to solve the situation in front of you, right? But I often find the more you discuss in this way, in a creative way of what are all the possibilities, people actually think of better solutions than they came up with initially because they're gathering information as they're going and they're doing these things. So the goal here is to try to say, okay, what kind of solutions can we come up with? And then, come up with as many as possible and then think about which is best, right? And what that means is um, sometimes, when people make offers, they do it and hold information back. So before I do this, I'll say to the other side, how about this? Neither one of us is making any offers to each other, right? What we're just going to do is think together. We're going to think creatively about the different possible solutions that we could come up with. And as I said, the solutions that people come up with when they do this are much, much better than, you know, what they thought they ultimately could come up with if they were just sitting in their own office doing this on their own. That interaction is what's key. Okay. So when you brainstorm, I think one of the things that you want to make sure people are really clear about this. So that first off, you say, look, no one's making any commitment. Okay. You're not making an offer. I'm not making an offer. We're just going to think together. And let's hold off on the criticism, right? One of the first meetings I ever facilitated, the group was getting stuck, and I said, okay, does everybody know how to brainstorm? And they said, yep, we understand the principles and everything, so let's go ahead. So I said, well, who has an idea for what we can do? Woman next to me says, how about we try this? And the man next to her says, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. So clearly they didn't know how to brainstorm. I had to say, look, critiquing comes later, right? There are some ideas that may not be the greatest. Um, so just hold off on your criticism. We'll all get there, right? But what we want to do is focus on creative and wild ideas. You know, you doing this or, us splitting the difference or me doing that is not a creative idea. What we want to say is based on what we know here, what's the best ideas we can come up with? And what happens is that Santiago might say, well, we could do this. And I might say, well, in order to make that work, Santiago, I'd have to add this in there, right? And so we go back and forth and we keep building out a solution that works for both of us as part of the process. So there's a video and I'll share it after the fact because we're kind of a bit late here. So I'll share that so that folks can watch it. And the reason that I share it is it gives you an idea of this whole idea of the first two steps of what we've talked about, understanding interest and developing options. So you'll see in that video how the person there describes a problem that one of his students and a coworker ran into and how they negotiated their way through it using this approach. Okay. Now, I know we only have a couple more minutes, so I just want to talk about the last idea. So anytime you negotiate or engage in a leadership endeavor, you always have to think, what is my alternative and something called your BATNA? Okay. And your BATNA turns out to be an acronym, which means your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what it means is in any situation, we always have to know if we don't reach agreement, if Santiago and I sit down and we are trying to negotiate, it's really important for me to go into the negotiation and for Santiago to know if we don't reach agreement, here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I could still do to satisfy my interests or things like that. So your BATNA is often known as your walk away alternative. So if I was to walk away from this leadership situation or this negotiation, what am I walking away to? And how bad is it or how good is it? A lot of times people will say to me, I've got this salary negotiation and this is what I agreed to. Did I get a good or a bad deal? And I'll say to them, the only way I can answer that question is, what was your alternative? What was your BATNA, right? If you didn't reach an agreement, did you have another job opportunity or were you going to be in the unemployment line, right? So it depends on, it's always a comparison, and your BATNA provides that comparison. So you always want to know, when I go into this negotiation, what's my BATNA? What can I do at that point if we don't reach agreement? And the good news is, if you actually have a good BATNA, meaning you could walk away, say in the example I gave you about the salary negotiation, maybe you have another offer or another interview, right? And when that's the case, you don't feel like you have to take what's in front of you. You have this alternative that you can think about and perhaps go back and forth between the different parties to do the best for yourself as you can. One of the really big mistakes that people make is that they don't analyze this. They don't understand their BATNA and they don't think it through. So it's really important that you take time to think through what your BATNA is and what's the BATNA of the other side, right? So ask yourself a very simple question, which is, what happens if I can't reach agreement? What will I do then? Right? And that's going to give you maybe a few different ideas. Well, I could do this or I could do that. And then you want to think, what's the best alternative that you have of those that you've thought about? Okay. Now, a lot of times people will say, well, should I act on this and there's a consequence when you exercise your BATNA, right? If you were to walk away from a situation, you will likely damage the relationship in some way, shape, or form. So you have to be conscious of the idea that if you were to use your BATNA, um, there's a consequence and it might be problematic. But again, the thing that you want to do here is ask yourself, what happens if we don't reach agreement? What do I do then? And if it's good, that's great. Then that means that you don't necessarily need to reach an agreement in this particular negotiation. And if you don't have a good BATNA, um, then that means that you probably want to stay at the negotiation table and keep trying to find the best solution possible. Okay. And like I said, the other thing that you want to do is not only think through your own BATNA, but also the BATNA of the other side. And because if you think, okay, if I think Santiago really needs to negotiate with me and he doesn't really have any other alternatives, and I'm pretty clear about that, then I understand that. And I know that, um, I can think about how to use that in some way, shape, or form to my advantage, right? You don't want to, I'm not a big fan of trying to uh, sort of use it to sort of hit somebody over the head with, if you will, or to use it as a threat. I don't think about it that way. I do it as part of my preparation. And I don't have to talk about it and I don't have to speak about it in that way to make it effective. Now, let me share this last story and then I'm going to stop because I know we're already a few minutes past. Um, but this is from a book that I wrote 4 years ago now. And it's a case study book of negotiation examples. And so I just want to share this because it gives you an idea of how BATNA plays such an important role in all of this. So there were two parties in this particular example. One's called Interagri and the other is called Solantar. And they were both based in China. Interagri was an agricultural company and Solantar provided agricultural equipment to Interagri and other companies. Okay. Now in China, importing things is very difficult. So there was no possibility to import the kind of equipment that Interagri needed from Solantar. And it turned out actually that Interagri needed to buy a very expensive piece of equipment from them in order to do their work. Okay. So this was, and Solantar was the only company in all of China that sold this specialized equipment. So this is what was called a sole supplier situation, right? There's one company that produces this, you can't import it. So it's a difficult negotiation for Interagri, right? They didn't have a good BATNA. They couldn't go elsewhere. So they were stuck. And when they sat down with Solantar, Solantar started asking them for a really high price, something that they really could not afford. So after the negotiation, they said, look, we're going to have to step away and think about what to do because we can't afford to have you do this. Interagri reached out and brought in a negotiation consultant, a friend of mine. And they said to him, here's the problem, right? We have this issue. We need to buy this equipment. We can't afford it. And what do we do? And he said, well, what's your BATNA? And they said, well, we don't have one. And he said, well, in every negotiation you have a BATNA, you have to think more carefully about it. So he then said to them, I want you to imagine that Solantar has gone out of business. How would you, as Interagri, still try to meet your need to buy that equipment? And he said, I'll be back in 3 days. I want you to think about it. At first, the Interagri team was stunned. They didn't know what to do and they struggled to come up with something. But then they started brainstorming, like I just mentioned, right? And one of the employees said, I wonder if there's another company within China that might own this machinery and that they might be willing to sell it to us. Well, they didn't know, so they said to the guy, "That's not a bad idea. Why don't you go see what you can find?" So he did some research and found that there was a company in Inner Mongolia, another province of China, that had purchased the equipment. So they went to that company and they said, "Are you interested in selling this equipment?" And it turned out that they were changing their business model, so they were interested in selling it. So now Interagri had their BATNA became we can buy this used equipment from this other company. Right? So when they went back to the table with Solantar, they were able to negotiate differently. They explained to Solantar that they had an alternative, a BATNA, that they would prefer to reach an agreement with Solantar. But if Solantar wasn't going to be more reasonable on their price, they would purchase this other used equipment and manage that way. Solantar initially said they didn't believe them. So Interagri said, well, you're welcome to speak to this other company. They did, and they found out that their BATNA was real. And so they had to ultimately change and um, charge a lot less for that machinery. So you see how using BATNA and improving your BATNA from time to time can also be helpful. So that's where I'm going to stop. I know we're already about 10 minutes past, but let me just see if there are any questions about anything I talked about today in the last hour or so that I can answer for all of you. Any questions, comments, you can put them into the chat box or raise your hand. And I do know that, like I said, that people, we've been on a little longer than we anticipated, but if there are comments and questions, I'm happy to try to take a few.
¿Alguna pregunta de alguno de ustedes? Ruth. Ruth has his hand up.
Yeah, please, Ruth.
Yes. What about the culture when somebody else have another culture that is like a different than ours? Like I have an experience, a bad experience that somebody else was from a a country that they cannot like look into woman's eyes, or
Hmm.
we cannot look into men's eyes. And actually there was a challenge to me because in his cultures I couldn't be able like to speak to him directly, and
Yeah.
I didn't know how to manage the situation. What
Hmm.
we can do in situations like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ruth. And culture plays a really important role in leadership and negotiation challenges for sure. So in that kind of a scenario, part of it depends on where the way that I think about it is if I'm going to be negotiating with someone from a different culture and I'm going there, I have to put more effort and attention into their culture and understanding how they do business. Even if they're coming to me, for example, in the United States, I still need to do that, but I want to understand um, that dimension. Okay. The second thing is, that when you have that kind of a problem or challenge and you recognize it, then you have to ask yourself, well, do I need to bring in a male counterpart? I know that's not easy, but sometimes those are the kinds of questions that we have to ask ourselves, especially if you remember that your goal is to try um, to meet your objective as best as possible. And so it might be that you might need to bring in a negotiation partner or colleague to work with you. And that may not feel very satisfying, but if you still want to achieve your objective, sometimes we have to do that. We have to recognize that there are these cultural constraints that can get in the way, and sometimes there's no easy answer. I would like to, think that cultures change and evolve, and sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And unfortunately, when that's the case, sometimes the only way that we can actually get where we want to go is by recognizing, okay, if in fact it's not appropriate for a man and a woman to be negotiating, be sitting alone together, there's a lot of those kinds of dimensions, right? Then we have to recognize that, and we have to try to either bring somebody else in or manage it a bit differently. It's not an easy one, and it also takes a lot to not take it personally in some ways, um, as well, because it can feel like that doesn't feel right. But in the end, if you really want to get where you want to go, sometimes that kind of thing is necessary. It's a great question, and it is something, and I would say, by the way, that it's really important to understand when you are working with people cross-culturally, it's really critical to understand their culture, what they bring to table, and understand in so many ways what you want to, how you can adapt and adjust to trying to manage things. Every culture, for example, still needs to get to the underlying interest in a negotiation, but people do it very differently, right? There are some cultures where I can't ask directly because that would be cause a loss of face to somebody, and perhaps in Asian cultures and places along those lines. So I have to think about asking people more indirectly or listening kind of for answers that might not be direct, um, and try to read between the lines, things along those lines. So, and there's a great article by a woman named Erin Mayer in Harvard Business Review that if you're going to negotiate cross culturally, you might want to look at the advice that she has in there. So let me just say this. Like I said, I know we're over time, so let me stop here. If you do have any further questions or comments, please feel free to email me. Santiago and others can provide my email address to folks so that if you did have some questions after the fact that you didn't feel comfortable answer or asking here, or we didn't have time to get to it, please feel free to email me and I'll do my best to get back to you. But I hope this has been helpful. And Santiago, I'd love to give you the last word to close this out.
Yes, I want to say thank you to you, Dr. Weiss, and also I wrote in the chat that at Bay Path University and Cambridge College, we do have masters in business administration and also DBA, where you can expand your knowledge about this topic of negotiation, but about other topics that are necessary for doing business in your area. So,
Great.
gracias a los que estuvieron, que hablan español. Estamos aquí a la orden en Cambridge College, Puerto Rico. Cambridge College es una institución que abre las puertas a los hispanohablantes, así que esto ha sido una experiencia para todos de aprendizaje, inclusive para mí mismo, al ver los ejemplos que el Dr. Weiss trajo para nosotros. Gracias por estar con nosotros.
Great. Muchas gracias, everyone. And thank you again. Have a great rest of your Saturday. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Saludos, Santiago.
Saludos, Costa.
Thank you. Bye, Professor Santiago.
Thank you.
Adiós. Adiós. Está a la orden acá.